Picture this. You're standing on a dusty plain 26 miles from your home, watching the horizon fill with enemy ships. Wave after wave of vessels stretch across the sea, their dark hulls blotting out the morning Sunday. The greatest military machine the world has ever known has come for you, and all that stands between your city and total annihilation is a handful of farmers, craftsmen, and citizen soldiers. This isn't the plot of some Hollywood blockbuster. This is the reality that faced Athens in September of 490 BCE, when 400 Greek warriors prepared to charge headlong into 40,000 Persian invaders at the Battle of Marathon. What happened next defied every rule of ancient warfare and changed the course of human history forever. A small force of citizen soldiers didn't just survive against impossible odds. They shattered the myth of Persian invincibility and proved that free men fighting for their homeland could triumph over the mightiest empire on earth. This wasn't just a military victory. It was the moment that Western civilization itself hung in the balance, decided by bronze spears and unbreakable will on a narrow coastal plain. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Everything you think you know about Marathon is probably wrong. The famous marathon run that inspired our modern Olympic race? Most likely a complete fabrication. The heroic charge across the plain? A desperate gamble that should have ended in massacre. The overwhelming Persian numbers? Even more staggering than most people realize. Today we're diving deep into the real story of Marathon, stripping away centuries of myth and legend to uncover the raw truth of how democracy itself was saved by the most audacious military gamble in ancient history. The Persian Empire of 490 BCE was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Stretching from the gates of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, it commanded the allegiance of over 20 nations and ruled more than 5 million square kilometers of territory. Under Darius I, known as Darius the Great, the Achaemenid Empire had reached the absolute pinnacle of its power. This wasn't just an empire. It was a military and administrative masterpiece that had conquered every opponent it had ever faced. The Persian war machine was built for total domination. Their armies drew from the finest warriors across their vast territories. Elite sparabara, or shield-bearers, formed the backbone of their infantry, wielding wicker shields and deadly spears with practiced precision. Median and Persian cavalry thundered across battlefields on horses bred for war, while the empire's subject peoples contributed their own specialized troops to the imperial cause. Persian archers were legendary for their accuracy and range, capable of darkening the sky with volleys of arrows that could break enemy formations before they ever reached Persian lines. But the true genius of the Persian Empire lay not just in its military might, but in its administrative brilliance. The empire was divided into satrapies, provinces governed by appointed officials who wielded enormous power while remaining answerable only to the great king. This system allowed the Persians to rule diverse peoples across vast distances, tolerating local customs and religions while extracting tribute and military service. It was a formula that had proven unstoppable for generations, rolling over kingdom after kingdom with the inexorable force of a tide. By 490 BCE, Persian eyes had turned westward toward the fractured city-states of Greece. To Darius and his generals, these squabbling Greek polias must have seemed like easy prey. After all, what could a collection of small independent cities hope to achieve against the organized might of the world's greatest empire? The Persians had already subjugated the Greek cities of Asia Minor with relative ease. Now it was time to complete the conquest and bring the mainland Greeks under Persian rule. The catalyst for invasion came from an unexpected source. The Greek cities of Ionia, Persian subjects on the western coast of Asia Minor, had risen in revolt against their imperial masters. The rebellion itself might have been contained, but Athens and Eretria had made a fatal ship's mistake. They had sent in soldiers to aid the rebels, even participating in the burning of important cities. To Sardis, one of the empire's most Darius, this was not just rebellion but an act of war by foreign powers against the Persian crown. When the Ionian revolt was finally crushed, Darius turned his attention to the Greek mainland with the focused fury of an emperor whose authority had been challenged. The punishment expedition he assembled was massive by the standards of the day, though modest by later Persian measures. Ancient sources vary wildly on the numbers, but modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 20 and 25,000 fighting men, supported by a fleet of 600 ships. To the Greeks, facing their own internal divisions and limited resources, these numbers must have seemed absolutely overwhelming. The Persian strategy was elegant in its simplicity. The fleet would carry the army across the Aegean, striking directly at Athens and Eretria, while avoiding the mountain passes and hostile territories of northern Greece. Once these two cities were destroyed and their populations enslaved, the remaining Greek states would surely see the futility of resistance and submit to Persian rule. It was a plan that had worked countless times before across the empire's expanding frontiers. But as the Persian fleet made its way across the dark waters of the Aegean, loaded with soldiers, horses, and siege equipment, they were sailing toward an encounter that would shatter every assumption about Greek weakness and Persian invincibility. The men they were about to face weren't professional soldiers or hardened mercenaries. They were citizens of Athens, farmers and craftsmen and merchants who had taken up arms to defend their city and their way of life. These men had something the Persians, for all their military excellence, couldn't fully understand or counter. They were fighting for their freedom, their families, and their homeland, and they were about to prove that free men defending their own soil could achieve what seemed impossible. The news of the Persian approach reached Athens like a thunderbolt. Runners brought word that Eretria had fallen after a brief siege, its population enslaved and its temples burned. The Persian fleet was now making its way south along the coast, and every Athenian knew they would be next. Panic might have been the natural response, but the Athenians did something remarkable instead. They chose to fight. The decision wasn't unanimous or easy. Athens in 490 BCE was still a young democracy, barely 20 years old, and the city was divided between those who favored resistance and those who believed accommodation with the Persians might be possible. Some wealthy Athenians, terrified of losing their property and status, quietly sent messages to the Persian commanders indicating their willingness to collaborate. But in the popular assembly, where every citizen had a voice, the decision was clear. Athens would not submit. They would march out to meet the invaders and defend their freedom with their lives. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Miltiades, a general whose personal history with the Persians made him uniquely qualified for the task ahead. Years earlier, Miltiades had ruled as a tyrant over Greek cities in the Persian-controlled Chersonese, serving as a vassal of the Persian Empire. But when the Ionian revolt erupted, he had thrown his lot in with the rebels, barely escaping Persian vengeance when the revolt collapsed. Now he found himself back in Greece, facing his former masters across a battlefield that would determine the fate of his adopted city. Miltiades understood the Persian way of war better than any other Greek commander. He knew their strengths, their tactics, and most importantly, their weaknesses. As the Athenian army prepared to march north too, Marathon Miltiades was already formulating a plan that would turn Greek disadvantages into Persian vulnerabilities. It was a strategy so audacious, so contrary to conventional military wisdom, that it might just work, or it might lead to the complete destruction of the Athenian army and the end of Greek independence forever. The Athenian force that marched out to Marathon was unlike any army the world had ever seen take the field. These weren't the professional warriors that filled the ranks of Persian battalions, or the mercenary companies that fought for the highest bidder across the Mediterranean. They were ordinary citizens who had answered their city's call, men who just days before had been tending their olive groves, working their forges, or conducting business in the agora. Farmers walked alongside potters, merchants marched beside blacksmiths, and wealthy landowners shared the road with their own servants, all united by a single purpose that transcended class and occupation. The core of the Athenian force consisted of roughly 9,000 hoplites, citizen soldiers who could afford the bronze armor, large round shield, and long spear that defined this distinctive fighting style. Each man had purchased his own equipment, a significant investment that demonstrated both his commitment to the city and his stake in its survival. Their bronze breastplates gleamed in the morning sun, while their distinctive crested helmets and red-plumed horsehair marked them as free men of Athens. Behind their large hoplon shields, these citizens had trained in the local gymnasia, practicing the complex maneuvers of the phalanx formation that could turn individual warriors into an unstoppable wall of bronze and iron. Alongside the Athenians marched a smaller contingent that would prove their loyalty beyond question. 1,000 Plataeans had answered Athens' call for aid, honoring an old alliance that bound their small city to its more powerful neighbor. These men had left their own walls undefended to stand with Athens in her hour of greatest need. Their presence doubled the symbolic importance of the coming battle, transforming it from a purely Athenian struggle into a broader fight for Greek independence. But perhaps most remarkably, scattered throughout the ranks were Athens' metics, foreign residents who had chosen to make the city their home. Though not citizens themselves, they had taken up arms to defend the place that had given them refuge and opportunity. Former slaves who had earned their freedom marched beside free men, while skilled craftsmen from across the Greek world prepared to fight for their adopted homeland. This army represented something entirely new in the ancient world, a force bound together not by tribal loyalty or royal command, but by shared ideals of freedom and self-determination. As the Greek force approached the plain of Marathon, they could see the Persian encampment spread across the beach like a vast city of tents and pavilions. Cooking fires sent columns of smoke into the morning air, while the sound of foreign voices, speaking dozens of different languages, drifted across the water. Persian ships lined the shore, their bronze-reinforced prows pointed toward the beach, ready to carry the army back to sea once Athens was conquered and burned. The sight that greeted the Greeks should have broken their resolve instantly. The Persian camp sprawled along nearly 2 miles of coastline, a testament to the sheer scale of the force they faced. Conservative estimates suggest the Persians numbered at least 15,000 fighting men, though the true figure may have been significantly higher. These weren't hastily assembled conscripts or reluctant vassals, but the cream of the Persian military machine, warriors drawn from across the empire's vast territories. At the heart of the Persian force stood the Immortals, Darius's elite guard whose ranks were always maintained at exactly 10,000 men. Clad in scale armor and carrying distinctive wicker shields, these professional soldiers had earned their fearsome reputation across a dozen campaigns. When one fell in battle, another immediately took his place, giving the unit its name and its aura of invincibility. They were supported by regiments of Median spearmen, their bronze-tipped weapons glinting in perfect formation, and squadrons of cavalry whose horses had been bred for war in the rolling plains of Central Asia. The Persian archers were perhaps the most feared component of the enemy force. These men could loose arrows with devastating accuracy at ranges that kept them safely beyond the reach of Greek spears. Their composite bows, crafted from horn, wood, and sinew, could penetrate most armor at close range and darken the sky with volleys that broke enemy formations before they could close for hand-to-hand combat. The Greeks had no answer to this ranged superiority, no protective artillery or counter-battery fire to neutralize the threat. Yet as Miltiades surveyed the enemy position from the hills overlooking the plain, he saw not just Persian strengths but critical vulnerabilities. The Persians had chosen their landing site for its convenience, not its tactical advantage. The plain of Marathon was bordered by hills on one side and marshland on the other, creating a natural funnel that would prevent the Persians from using their numerical superiority effectively. More importantly, the Persian cavalry, perhaps their most devastating weapon, would struggle on the broken ground and soft earth near the marshes. The Persian battle plan was straightforward and had worked countless times before. Their archers would soften the enemy formation with devastating volleys. Their cavalry would sweep around the flanks to attack from behind, and their infantry would advance in overwhelming waves to finish any survivors. It was a formula that had conquered half the Nound and proven against every Conce-world, testivable enemy. Against a small force of Greek citizen soldiers, it should have guaranteed swift and total victory. But Miltiades was counting on something the Persians couldn't anticipate, something that had never before appeared on any ancient battlefield. His men weren't fighting for conquest or plunder or imperial glory. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. Every man in the Greek line knew that defeat meant not just death, but the enslavement of everyone they loved. Their wives would be dragged away in chains, their children sold in foreign markets, their city reduced to smoking ruins. This wasn't just another battle in some distant campaign. This was a fight for survival itself. As the two armies faced each other across the narrow plain, the morning sun climbed higher into a clear September sky. The Greeks could hear the Persian war horns echoing across the field, see the glint of bronze and gold in the enemy ranks, smell the dust kicked up by thousands of sandaled feet. Every rational calculation said they were about to die. Every military manual would have counseled retreat. But these weren't rational soldiers following textbook strategies. They were free men making a stand that would echo through eternity. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it came one of the most audacious tactical decisions in military history. As dawn broke over the plain of Marathon, Miltiades gathered his war council among the olive trees that dotted the hillside. The discussion that followed would either save Athens or doom it forever. Traditional Greek warfare called for a solid phalanx formation, 8 men deep across the entire front, presenting an unbroken wall of bronze shields and iron-tipped spears. But Miltiades proposed something that must have seemed like madness to his fellow commanders. He would deliberately weaken the center of his line, thinning it to just 4 ranks while strengthening the wings to 8 men deep. This went against every principle of Greek military doctrine, every lesson learned in countless battles against rival city-states. A weak center invited disaster, allowing the enemy to punch through and roll up the flanks from behind. Yet Miltiades insisted this was their only hope. He had studied Persian tactics during his years in their service, and he understood something his fellow Greeks did not. The Persians always concentrated their best troops in the center, expecting to break through and scatter their enemies like leaves before a storm. The plan was breathtakingly simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. The weakened Greek center would absorb the initial Persian assault, bending backward under the pressure but not breaking. Meanwhile, the strengthened wings would smash through the lighter Persian flanks, then wheel inward to surround the enemy center. It required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and more courage than any reasonable person should possess. One mistake, one moment of panic or hesitation, and the entire army would be destroyed. As the Greek commanders debated this radical strategy, Persian scouts were already probing their positions. Mounted archers rode close enough to loose arrows at the Greek outposts, testing their resolve and gathering intelligence about their numbers and deployment. The message these scouts carried back to their commanders should have brought confidence to the Persian camp. The Greeks were outnumbered at least 3 to 1, possibly 4 to 1. They had no cavalry, no archers worth mentioning, no siege engines or specialized troops. They were exactly what Persian intelligence had predicted, a small force of amateur soldiers equipped with obsolete weapons and outdated tactics. But there was something the Persian scouts couldn't measure, something that wouldn't show up in any intelligence report. They couldn't quantify the desperation of men fighting for their homes, the fury of fathers protecting their children, the unbreakable determination of citizens defending their freedom. These intangibles would prove more valuable than all the professional training and imperial resources the Persians could muster. The Persian commander, a general named Artaphernus, who had earned his reputation in the conquest of Ionia, made his own tactical preparations with the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. His battle plan followed the standard Persian template that had crushed enemies from India to Egypt. The elite troops would form the center, ready to punch through whatever resistance the Greeks could offer. The flanks would be held by allied contingents and lighter troops, sufficient to prevent any Greek flanking maneuver while the center did its work. Behind the main line, cavalry units waited for the signal to sweep around the Greek flanks and complete the encirclement. Most importantly, Artaphernus positioned his archers where they could do maximum damage. These skilled bowmen would open the battle with devastating volleys, disrupting the Greek formation and weakening their resolve before the infantry closed for the final assault. The Persian composite bows could penetrate Greek armor at close range and maintain lethal accuracy at distances far beyond the reach of Greek spears. No army had ever successfully charged through such a storm of arrows, and the Persians saw no reason why these Greek farmers should be the first. As the morning progressed, both armies completed their final preparations. Persian priests performed ritual sacrifices to ensure divine favor, while their soldiers checked weapons, adjusted armor, and received final instructions from their officers. The multi-ethnic nature of the Persian force was clearly visible as different contingents prepared according to their own customs and traditions. Median spearmen formed ranks with mathematical precision, their bronze-tipped weapons creating a forest of glittering points. Scythian archers tested their bowstrings and counted their arrows, each man carrying enough shafts to darken the sky. Persian cavalry checked their horses and weapons, ready to deliver the killing blow once the infantry had done its work. On the Greek side, preparations took on a more personal character. These were not professional soldiers following routine procedures, but citizens making what might be their final preparations for battle. Men wrote hurried messages to their families, pressing small scrolls into the hands of servants who would carry word back to Athens. Others performed private rituals, pouring libations to their ancestors and patron gods, seeking divine protection for the ordeal ahead. The atmosphere was tense but determined, filled with the quiet conversations of men who knew they might not see another sunset. Miltiades moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and making final adjustments to the battle plan. His presence was crucial to Greek morale, for he alone among their commanders had faced the Persians before and lived to tell the tale. His was infectious, spreading confidence through the ranks like fire through dry grass. When nervous soldiers questioned the wisdom of their thin center, Miltiades reminded them that Greeks had always been outnumbered by their enemies. When others worried about Persian archery, he pointed out that arrows were useless once the lines closed for hand-to-hand combat. The most critical moment came when Miltiades addressed the entire army, his voice carrying across the silent ranks in the pre-dawn darkness. His words were simple but powerful, reminding every man why they had come to this place and what they were fighting to preserve. He spoke of Athens, the city that had given birth to democracy and made every citizen a free man. He reminded them of their children, who would either inherit freedom or grow up in Persian chains. Most importantly, he told them that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for all of Greece, for all free peoples everywhere who believed that men should govern themselves rather than bow to foreign kings. As the sun climbed higher and the moment of battle approached, the Persian army began its advance across the plain. The sight was magnificent and terrible, a moving wall of bronze and steel that stretched from the hills to the marshes. War drums beat a steady rhythm, their deep bass notes mixing with the higher tones of Persian horns and the clash of weapons against shields. Banners fluttered above the advancing ranks, displaying the symbols of distant provinces and conquered peoples. The ground trembled under thousands of marching feet, while dust clouds rose to mark the army's progress across the battlefield. The Greeks watched this awesome display from their positions on the higher ground, every man knowing that his life would be measured in minutes once the battle began. Yet there was no panic, no mass flight to safety. These citizen soldiers had made their choice, and they would see it through to the end. As the Persian line drew closer, Greek officers made final adjustments to their formations, ensuring that every man knew his place and his duty in the desperate gamble they were about to attempt. The distance between the armies shrank steadily, measured now in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Persian archers began testing their range, loosing scattered arrows that fell short of the Greek line, but served notice of what was to come. The psychological pressure was immense, designed to break enemy morale before the real killing began. Every Persian commander knew that battles were often won or lost in these final moments before contact, when fear could turn disciplined soldiers into fleeing mobs. But the Greeks held firm, their bronze-faced shields reflecting the morning sun like mirrors. Behind those shields, ordinary men prepared to attempt something that had never been done before in the history of warfare. They were about to charge directly into the teeth of the most powerful military machine on earth, trusting their lives to a plan so desperate that it bordered on suicide. In moments, they would discover whether courage and freedom could triumph over professional skill and overwhelming numbers, whether democracy itself could survive its first great test on the field of battle. And so, when the dust settled and the Persian ships disappeared over the horizon, the impossible had become reality. 6,400 Persian bodies littered the plain of Marathon, while only 192 Greeks lay dead among them. The myth of Persian invincibility lay shattered alongside their broken weapons, and the course of Western civilization had been altered forever. But this victory was more than just a military triumph. It proved that free men fighting for their homeland could stand against any empire, no matter how vast or powerful. The farmers and craftsmen who charged across that dusty plain didn't just save Athens, they saved the very idea that ordinary people could govern themselves. that democracy was worth dying for, that freedom was stronger than fear. The echoes of Marathon still resonate today in every election, every protest, every moment when ordinary citizens stand up to power and refuse to bow. Those bronze spears and leather shields may have crumbled to dust centuries ago, but the spirit that carried them to victory lives on, wherever people choose courage over comfort, principle over safety. The next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference, remember Marathon. Sometimes, all it takes is a few hundred ordinary people willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in.